reason I'm excited for this finals in general with all of these three players is because everyone's looking for that big win, right? A lot of these players have good accomplishments under their belt, but there aren't that many players that have actually won a major. And so I think within these finalists, yeah, they're all really looking to secure their first major tournament victory. So quickly taking a look at the teams, Leonardo running that Sun team. He was very dominant with this in the European bracket. We've seen Sun quite a lot. He's got that Regieleki and that Umbreon. You know, we've seen other Sun teams with Pokemon like Grimmsnarl and Porygon. And so, yeah, definitely a very dynamic team here with tons of options, and that's one of the reasons why Sun is such a dominant archetype.
And on the opposing side here, Jonathan, I feel like we've touched on his team a couple of times already, but featuring that Kyogre and that Torkoal as well. So two different forms of weather paired with that Incineroar, that Grimmsnarl, the Venusaur, and that Tornadus, which is definitely not like any of the other teams that we've seen here, but I'm really excited to see it in action in these finals.
Yeah, I think this matchup's actually going to be so interesting because theoretically, in my opinion, all 6 Pokemon are viable to come out. And in a best of 5, you have a lot more room for exploration, right? To me, sometimes if you have matchups where it's like you need to just bring the same 4 Pokemon over and over again because your opponent's like, that's just how the matchup plays out, where your other 2 Pokemon just don't offer you nearly enough. But in my eyes, I think we could theoretically see players adjust their teams throughout all the different games in this set because I think there's a lot of viability between all of them. So, you know, to break down the matchup a little bit more, I think one thing that's really critical for Jonathan's side of the field is, you know, weather control, right? Kyogre is really good, especially against Groudon and Charizard, but that's mainly if you have the rain up. Venusaur, I think on both Pokemon or both sides is like a really essential component because I think that is the strongest max option often. And one thing that's really interesting is that these Venusaurs actually carry Weather Ball. So, you know, normally in a Venusaur versus Venusaur matchup, if you don't have Weather Ball, well, you're not really damaging each other too much, but in the case of this matchup, they can go for Weather Ball with that Sun that's super effective, and that even turns into a max flare. So I think Venusaur is going to be a really critical component from both players' sides, and it's going to be really interesting, right? When do you Dynamax? And if you have the late Dynamax, can you basically make sure you don't take too much damage and come, you know, back in the late game? One other thing to watch out for is the potential sleep, right? There is sleep powder, of course, on these Venusaurs. Umbreon has Yawn, Torkoal has Yawn, and so it's going to be really important to try to mitigate that sleep because you know it's going to be coming your way, and you have to play around that option, especially with Venusaur, because there are just so many things it can do right from the start of the game.
Oh, certainly. It's definitely going to be some fantastic matches, though. Let's get into it to see what these players are going to be starting off with round 1 of the winners finals here. So we see that Venusaur coming out next to that Torkoal right away on Jonathan's side. Venusaur facing down against another Venusaur, but paired with that Umbreon.
So Venusaur and Torkoal from Jonathan's end, you know, applying a pressure immediately. You would assume he has Kyogre in the back, but it makes sense. You don't want to bring out that Kyogre immediately because then, of course, Leonardo could just switch into Groudon. So this is going to be interesting, right? Because Umbreon, I think, is a really solid option. Shouldn't take too much damage and can go for that Yawn, which you see Leonardo opting for. So Yawn is really big here, right? If you can put Venusaur to sleep as it Gigantamaxes and then conserve your max for the late game, then you might have a really big advantage if you don't take too much damage. And so Leonardo here going for the Yawn, wants to conserve that Venusaur, doesn't want to take any damage from the Torkoal. You know, I thought like here Leonardo had the option to potentially just max that Venusaur, but maybe doesn't want to take a fire type attack from the opposing Torkoal or eat up a Yawn from the opposing side as well. So he is going to retreat immediately into that Incineroar.
Definitely, as you said earlier on, with those Venusaurs being a big part of this matchup, not wanting to risk it too early on. Last thing you want is to lose your Venusaur and be at a disadvantage here, but we are going to see a max from Jonathan's Venusaur, just looking to apply some early pressure here against Leonardo, and this Venusaur with this Sun is going to be going fast and speedy here. So to start off, going for that max ooze right into that Umbreon here, trying to pick up some chip damage and will get a special attack boost to boot.
Yeah, a little critical hit there to increase the damage output, but you can see how tanky Umbreon is, right? Even with that critical hit, doesn't fall under 50%. Gets that Yawn off onto Venusaur, so Venusaur will fall asleep next turn unless it switches out, and it is a trade of Yawns here, as Torkoal ends up going for the Yawn as well, so that's why Leonardo didn't want to stay in with Venusaur. The goal was kind of to put Jonathan's Venusaur to sleep, and then go from there, hoping for the late game Dynamax potential. Leonardo's side of the board right now is a little bit more passive, although Incineroar in the Sun can actually do a sizable amount of damage to Venusaur on the opposing end, and I think even though Jonathan's Venusaur now has that Yawn and will fall asleep after this turn, I really feel like he's going to want to go for that G-Max Vine Lash, because if you just switch out, you lose so much of the strength of Venusaur, right? G-Max Vine Lash's residual damage just adds up so much, and while the Venusaur will fall asleep after this turn, I think it's still worth going for it, because otherwise you just don't gain anything from this turn. So Leonardo's Incineroar here also in a weird spot where, it is going to fall asleep after this turn, so opting for that Flare Blitz just to do as much damage as possible. U-turn was viable as well just to swap out, but is going to stay in.
We are going to see that Vine Lash come out from the Venusaur. 1 HP left on this Umbreon, and that Flare Blitz is going to do a lot of damage to this Venusaur. Of course, Incineroar taking a chunky amount of damage back with that recoil, but that 1 HP live means that Umbreon can go for another Yawn here into that Torkoal, which is just going to pick up this KO on the Umbreon.
So Umbreon hanging on with that 1 HP, gets that critical attack off before fainting, and Jonathan now has gotten that G-Max Vine Lash residual damage off, so I think that's really critical, right? Like, the Incineroar is already really heavily damaged, we know that it can't heal itself either, and it's asleep, so it's essentially on a timer at this point. Of course, there's Venusaur and Groudon in the back for Leonardo. I like the decision to bring in Venusaur. Playing around the residual damage from G-Max Vine Lash is really important, right? And Venusaur does not actually take residual damage from that Vine Lash because it's grass type. And so that's really important. You get that free switch in into the Venusaur. You know that Jonathan's Venusaur is not going to be able to do anything this turn. One thing that's a little bit awkward though is, do you want to switch out your Incineroar here, or do you just want it to faint, because after 2 turns of Vine Lash, it should go down. The other thing here is, can Leonardo's Venusaur actually KO Jonathan's Torkoal? Because if not, Torkoal can maybe retaliate back with the Yawn, and if you get the Yawn in return to Venusaur, then the comeback potential is greatly decreased, because Leonardo basically needs to maximize 3 turns of Gigantamax with Venusaur.
A Yawn from both sides here definitely can just put on so much pressure, so Leonardo really has to figure out what to do with that Torkoal to not be taking a nap just like Jonathan's Venusaur is. So to start off, we are going to see that Max Quake here, and it's going to be a question of whether it picks up this KO or not, and no, bringing it down to the yellow, but Torkoal hanging on with a really good amount of HP here, not wanting to go anywhere at all, which means this Torkoal will have the opportunity to do some damage or get this Yawn off after recovering even more HP from this berry. Venusaur, of course, just taking another turn to sleep here. Incineroar as well. I mean, we knew this going into this matchup. There's going to be a lot of sleeping, and of course the Yawn into Leonardo's Venusaur as well for Venusaur.
So I think, this is definitely an interesting position. Leonardo started off a little bit behind in this match, and the Yawn, successfully goes off into the opposing Venusaur now. So now, yeah, you want to go for that Vine Lash just like Jonathan did, because that's so much residual damage. Otherwise, you at best pick up a KO with Venusaur, but that's it. I think what is tough for Leonardo right now is, Jonathan presumably has that Kyogre in the back. Leonardo, we saw, has that Groudon, and Kyogre is going to win that trade-off against the Groudon, just especially if you get that rain up, right? And the Incineroar on Leonardo's end is on a timer as well, 1 more turn of Vine Lash, and it is going to faint. So while both of Jonathan's Pokemon are asleep, Kyogre in the late game is looking really good. The main thing you want to do is position the Kyogre out before, Leonardo's Venusaur can wake up. And so a knockout here will actually be beneficial for Jonathan, because you get that free switch in, and then Venusaur is at least going to take a guaranteed turn of sleep this next turn, so you don't really have to flip the coin to see when it wakes up, at least for 1 turn.
Oh, definitely. Incineroar is going to hit that U-turn just to get a little bit of repositioning here on Leonardo's end. Looking to, of course, bring in that Groudon here. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this match shakes up with the sleep turns and stuff on the Venusaur and the Torkoal, as well. All these Pokemon just taking a little rest. And, that can really shift the way the game plays out. Of course, you're talking about, the Groudon and Kyogre in the late game. But early game, if there could be some early wake-ups from this Venusaur, it could really shift the tide.
Yeah, and Incineroar there does manage to wake up, manages to get the Groudon in, but it's kind of awkward now, right? You normally want to conserve Groudon to win that Weather War, but with Groudon out, Jonathan now has the ability to just bring out the Kyogre immediately. The fourth Pokemon is definitely up in the air. I think Tornadus makes the most sense out of all of his options, and so there's the Kyogre coming out first. Kyogre plus Tornadus is looking really good in the endgame if you actually have Tornadus out. So we'll have to see what Jonathan's last one is, but either way, Kyogre comes in a great spot, able to just put on pressure with those water type attacks immediately. And I'm curious, what the speed interaction between the Groudon and Kyogre is here, but most Groudons these days don't have that much speed investment, so Kyogres typically will outspeed them. So you can see Leonardo feels forced to switch out the Groudon, that way you at least get to, change the weather again and have Sun up for this late game, and I think that's the correct play here for Leonardo's end.
It definitely preserving the weather for Leonardo is going to be important, with Jonathan having multiple ways to manipulate it. On the inside, actually going to bring that Torkoal back and bring out that Tornadus, revealing the fourth and final Pokemon here. Venusaur, of course, sleeping. And we are going to see a hit from this Kyogre here to just pick up the KO on the Incineroar.
So by picking up the knockout onto Incineroar, now Leonardo's down to his final two Pokemon, right? One thing that's really critical in this matchup is the Weather War. Can Jonathan get the rain up for the endgame and make sure Leonardo can't change the weather? And the answer to that question in this game is yes, right? You can very easily, this next turn, just protect the Tornadus, switch Kyogre out into Torkoal, and then get the Kyogre back in. So what's interesting now is, do you predict the switch out into Torkoal because you can intentionally not KO Torkoal? What Leonardo doesn't want to do is, just give Jonathan a free switch and back into that Kyogre. And I think here you also have to worry about potential attacks from the Tornadus. This Tornadus from Jonathan's end we've seen is actually a Life Orb Tornadus that can do a little bit more damage. So it's definitely going to be a tricky endgame here. Groudon opting to, consider attacking here. I think that makes sense. I think very rarely will Kyogre just stay in here, especially with the threat of Venusaur waking up. So the question is, do you protect Kyogre or do you just switch out here? And then on Leonardo's end, if you just knock out the Torkoal and give that free switch and back into Kyogre, then Kyogre and Tornadus looks amazing in this endgame.
Jonathan, of course, swapping that Kyogre out, wanting to protect it and keep the weather in his favor. Of course, that protect as well from the Tornadus. Venusaur, another turn of sleep here, as this Groudon just looks to fire off an attack onto Jonathan's side, connecting that Rock Slide onto the Torkoal and picking up the KO there for Jonathan to have that free switch in back into Kyogre.
That's exactly what Jonathan wanted, right? Gets the free switch in here, and now you just outspeed with the Kyogre. You can also, set up a Tailwind with that Tornadus, and so that was a pretty ideal turn for Jonathan. I think Leonardo could have done something creative here, which was intentionally not knocking out the Torkoal, maybe even going for something like Swords Dance on Groudon. I suppose it's pretty tricky still because the Torkoal, I believe, we've seen it also has Protect, so then the subsequent turn, you can just set up a Tailwind with Tornadus, sacrifice the Tornadus, get that free switching into Kyogre. But now it's even tougher for Leonardo, where Tornadus and Kyogre are both out. You have that weather control. There is going to be the Hurricane, and that should just cleanly knock out Venusaur. Kyogre now knocks out Groudon, so kind of textbook endgame here for Jonathan.
Of course, that Tornadus having to take the Venusaur out, as it's the only thing really pressuring the Kyogre here. The Kyogre, the huge water spout, of course, taking down that Groudon, and Jonathan is going to take the first game in this best of 5, putting himself in the lead here in the winners finals.
Yeah, so 7-0 right now in the tournament between all the individual games he's played. Definitely a strong start, and I think that last game was, one, defined by Weather Wars. Two, obviously, Yawn was a really big deal as well. Both players actually ended up getting hit by Yawn on their first turn of Max. And in the end, I think that Jonathan just had a slightly larger lead, right? Leonardo went with some passive Pokemon in that game, Pokemon like Umbreon and Incineroar. Those were actually really great picks in this set, but overall, Leonardo just wasn't able to actually do enough damage with the main sweepers in Venusaur and Groudon. One thing that's really important in this matchup is potentially conserving that Venusaur so that you can actually deal with the Kyogre in the late game. Kyogre was able to just come out after the Venusaur on Leonardo's end got put to sleep. You don't have to risk taking as much damage, and then the Tornadus is also able to do really, really consistent damage. So I think in that end, even though both players traded Yawn because Leonardo's team was a little bit bulkier and had less damage output, Jonathan really had the advantage there. And so I think Leonardo really needs to get more out of the early game. Ideally, don't let your Venusaur get put to sleep because it's such a critical component. So we saw that Max Quick doesn't KO Torkoal. You're going to need a little bit of chip damage onto it before you can actually KO with the Max Quake.
It's definitely good with this first game that Leonardo can recognize that, be figuring out this information slowly and surely, and be able to adjust going into a game 2. With being said, let's get into this game 2 to see what adjustments are made coming out from him. So we are going to see from Jonathan's end actually opting to lead with the Kyogre Tornadus this time around, facing off against, of course, the Umbreon and the Venusaur once again from Leonardo here.
Yeah, so Kyogre is definitely a mix-up this time around, and typically, you don't want to lead your weather user because your opponent can just switch out, right? So this is exactly what Leonardo's going for, opting to go for the switch, and this is the classic scary thing around playing against Venusaur is, yeah, it can just go for that Sleep Powder turn 1. So Leonardo trying to make that switch out right now. Whether or not it connects is a really big deal because often I feel like in these situations, if you miss Sleep Powder, you just put yourself in such a big hole. So let's see if Venusaur is actually able to connect on this Sleep Powder. I think from Jonathan's end, you can go for a pretty safe Tailwind and Water Spout. But, Tornadus could opt to max here and go for an attack as well. But yeah, you don't really want to max in case you get hit by a Sleep Powder on turn 1.
Oh, certainly. That Tornadus does opt to just go for that Tailwind, but unfortunately is just going to be put to bed by this Venusaur here. The Sleep Powder does connect. We will see that Water Spout coming out from the Kyogre. Does a really good amount of damage to the ground, but not picking up the KO since the sun is out, and giving the Groudon the opportunity to be restoring some HP back with that berry.
Yeah, so large amounts of damage, able to control the weather a little bit more, and this time around, Venusaur in a decent spot, opting to just go for that max right away. And I like the decision to max Quake into Kyogre here. I think very rarely will Kyogre actually stay in because you're just not going to do very much damage, so switch out here is, very likely. Jonathan, of course, could just protect the Kyogre, but yeah, he is going to switch out. And max Quake getting that special defense boost is actually so valuable because Jonathan's team is specially oriented, and it is going to be that Torkoal, right? So you actually do a sizable amount of damage to that Torkoal and put it in KO range from another max Quake, and that means that Venusaur, can avoid getting hit by a Yawn, and that's so critical in this matchup because last time around Venusaur just didn't do enough for Leonardo.
Yeah, we were just talking before this match how it was pivotal that he got some damage down on that Torkoal and that max Quake into that slot. Definitely it gives him the opportunity here, and of course Venusaur Max is coming out here. I really like to opting to just hit into that slot. As you said, the switch was pretty, it was coming. You're not going to want to risk that Kyogre, but with the opportunity to bring this Torkoal down and be able to take it out next turn, we'll just leave Jonathan with the one form of weather to be playing around with. So of course Max Quake, big amount of damage here, leaving that Torkoal very vulnerable for the next turn regardless of the berry HP it's going to be restoring now.
Absolutely. One thing that we haven't talked about too much is using Max Quake defensively, right? Once again, Jonathan's team has so many special attackers, the Kyogre, Tornadus, the Torkoal, the Venusaur. There actually is basically very little physical damage that's reliable. So at the end of the day, if you can actually get a couple of special defense boosts, that's really, really valuable, especially for the late game.
Of course, the Torkoal here, not wanting to go down, opting to just go for a protect here. Are going to see big hit on this Venusaur here, and this Venusaur just going to be firing back with this Max Quake. It'll definitely be interesting to see how Jonathan responds to all the bulk that Leonardo is building up with. As you said, the only attacker on side to potentially deal with that is the Incineroar, which is certainly not coming in this 4, so it'll be interesting to see how he adjusts here.
Yeah, and the Umbreon notably is getting a bunch of these special defense boosts as well, so that will make it tougher for Jonathan to actually deal with it in the end game. The main downside to Umbreon is that it doesn't actually do enough damage. You can actually, yeah, sure, you can disrupt with the Snarl, but the damage output is definitely lacking, and so Leonardo still needs to make sure that he can do enough damage in these next couple of turns, right? In the end, the Venusaur was able to get a fair amount of, special defense boost, but actually hasn't picked up a KO yet. It's the last turn of Max here as well, and I think you really want to Vine Lash here just so that you have that residual damage, but that means that Venusaur effectively will have spent 3 turns to just pick up a KO onto Torkoal. So once again, because Leonardo's opting for a little bit more defense with Pokemon like that Umbreon and like that Incineroar, it's tougher to deal damage to Kyogre in the late game, and so if you're Jonathan, you can actually eliminate Venusaur and put yourself at a point where it's just Umbreon, Groudon, and the Incineroar. Kyogre can actually really sweep through in the end game.
Oh, definitely. That Tornadus just opting to protect this turn as the Venusaur hits the Vine Lash into the Torkoal. Of course, not really doing too much damage to it. That Umbreon getting the opportunity to hit into it as well, fishing for that KO, and it's going to get it. This Torkoal going down. Jonathan left only with the rain on his side here in the back.
Yeah, and so Kyogre looking pretty good right now, right? You've been able to stall out the max from Leonardo's end. The scary thing is that the Umbreon and the Venusaur do have a bunch of increased stages of special defense, and so Umbreon definitely can spread a couple of yawns right now, but Jonathan can obviously pivot out of the yawns by just switching out, right? So Jonathan actually bringing in that Venusaur first, and I like the decision to go for that just because right now if you bring out Kyogre, you're not going to do that much damage with the water spell. Leonardo could always switch out the Umbreon back out into Groudon anyway, and then Venusaur could go for something like a Sleep Powder here. So I do think it's the correct decision to bring out the Venusaur first, and now this time around Jonathan can play towards that late game max. And so Leonardo's main attackers in Venusaur and Groudon are pretty heavily damaged, and these aren't exactly going to take too many more attacks. And so the thing here from Leonardo, you have a good lead, but the question is, are you able to actually deal enough damage in the next couple of turns? Umbreon's going to be really critical in spreading yawns, but it's not going to be the one dealing damage. And so what's important for Leonardo is basically making sure whatever's next that Umbreon can actually pick up a KO or two. And if you can knock out Tornadus, then you can win that weather war, and that's actually really crucial here as well.
Incineroar coming out for that Venusaur. So all the special defense boosts that we were talking about that were going to make it difficult to break through the team, just gone just like that. But with Incineroar out, we'll have the Flare Blitz and Fake Out Pressure. Of course, we are just going to see another Tailwind come out on Jonathan's end here. This Venusaur goes for their ball, hitting to the Incineroar and not really doing too much here. Brian hitting that yawn into the Venusaur and making it so Jonathan has to be trying to pivot out next turn or risk going to sleep.
Exactly, yeah. The Vine Lash damage is also adding off, so, that definitely helps. Earlier I was talking about how do you do enough damage in this late game, and Vine Lash is definitely going to add up really, really quickly. So that's the thing with this Umbreon. Now you've gotten all these special defense boosts. It's looking quite bulky. Up into Snarl, that covers, any switch outs. Like you mentioned, this Venusaur now is effectively forced to switch out. So you should know that the switch is coming here. I'd be very surprised to see Venusaur stay in. If it were to stay in, I guess you could fish for something like a Sleep Powder. At this point, Kyogre actually becomes a really interesting max option for Jonathan, right? Because everything is kind of whittled away. It gives you more weather control. Should KO a Groudon, even just because Groudon is so low. And so exactly, there is that Venusaur switch out. And one thing, that Leonardo can do is keep going for yawns on every turn, so you're basically forcing a Pokemon to switch out, and that kind of denies Jonathan the option of actually maxing at any point.
Definitely, that is going for yet again another Protect here. Incineroar is just going to take the opportunity to U-turn into that Kyogre, pick up a little bit of chip damage, and just swap out into his own Groudon just to be resetting that weather back to the sun, getting rid of the rain here.
Yeah, so the rain will go away. One thing that's so tough about this matchup is the sun obviously helps your matchup against the Kyogre, but then Jonathan's Venusaur can actually take advantage of that. What's really critical here is that Leonardo also opted for that Snarl rather than fishing for another yawn. So Kyogre actually manages to come in for free. Does take a special attack drop, but isn't pressured to fall asleep the next turn. This Vine Lash damage is adding up really quickly though, and so this next turn is critical, right? Jonathan at some point has to decide when you actually want to max, and it feels like if you don't max now, you just lose so much out of the turn, right? So Leonardo considering to switch out once again, get some more positioning, and Umbreon here, it looks like fishing for that yawn onto Tornadus actually rather than targeting the Kyogre. This is an opportunity for Kyogre to finally max, right? And that will allow you to actually change the weather as well into the rain. And so it's all about, doing enough damage once again, so that, because Umbreon's not going to win the end game damage-wise, so you just need to make sure you get a little bit more damage across the board. That Tornadus is going to switch out. It's basically done everything it's needed to thus far, and isn't going to really, want to fish for Hurricanes right now, especially when they're very inaccurate.
Of course, a swap coming out from both players. It's going to be Incineroar coming out on Leonardo's side here. Do you think with the Snarl that happened last turn into that Kyogre that it could still be the viable max option here, or is it just that he has to go for pressure?
I think Jonathan just answered your question, Sarah. Looks like Jonathan thinks the answer to that is yes, and it's really tough, right? I think this Umbreon has put on so much pressure, but Leonardo, I think maybe hoping to see Venusaur max, and was trying to catch the Venusaur on that switch in with that yawn, but instead Kyogre is the one that maxes, and this is going to be interesting, right? Because sure, the sun is up, sure, it's at -1 special attack, but at the end of the day, like, it's still a max geyser, right? And now you've changed the weather. Groudon can't really safely switch in at this point. You can't go for fake out onto a Kyogre, and more importantly, right, there's no damage really coming out this turn. The Yawn comes out, but I think, you know, if it went into Kyogre, this turn might be a little bit better. Then at least you can go for fake out onto the Venusaur slot. Kyogre will fall asleep after the next turn, but now Kyogre and Rain looking pretty strong right now. There's no damage out certainly from this turn, so feels like Leonardo needs to try to position himself so that you get the sun up. But then the awkward thing is that Jonathan has his Venusaur at full health. If you get the sun up, then Jonathan's Venusaur can just weather ball into Leonardo's Venusaur. So it feels like while Leonardo was able to do a fair amount of damage in that early game, now you're in a really awkward spot. Really critical decision for Jonathan to finally push the go button with that Kyogre and Max. I think Leonardo was probably expecting Venusaur to Max in this end game. And now this Kyogre is looking really, really strong.
No sun coming out from Leonardo's end. It means this Max Geyser is going to hit at full effect here, picking up that KO on the Incineroar here, but will allow Leonardo to have that free switch in to the Groudon or the Venusaur. Of course, the Umbreon just looking for another Snarl to try and bring this Kyogre down, and to boot, get a special attack drop on the Tornadus as well on the swap in.
I think what's really critical here is that Jonathan recognizes that his Venusaur is actually really good in the endgame, even when it's not maxed, right? So what he did was focus down the Incineroar. Leonardo ended up giving up the Incineroar, and that Incineroar is probably the best answer to Jonathan's Venusaur, right? It has that Assault Vest, it can take a Earth Power with no problem, retaliate back with the Flare Blitz, and it's a really big offensive pull against Jonathan's Venusaur. Now that Leonardo has given that up, well, everything's chipped away on Leonardo's end, right? You have a Groudon, you have a Venusaur, but Jonathan's Venusaur can one-shot both of those, and you have one more turn of Max with a Kyogre here as well. So one thing I'm curious about is, can the Groudon actually survive a Max Geyser? It is at, the Kyogre is at -2 special attack and the sun is up. So you have to make the decision here. Do you just give up the Groudon? Do you hope that you can survive? Or, you know, you could always go for a Protect as well. Because once again, this Umbreon's really, really handy, right? It has those increased stages of special attack, but you do need to pick up KOs at this point, because yes, you whittled away at the Tornadus and the Kyogre, but Umbreon, once again, is not really going to win the end game, especially if Jonathan has both Venusaur and Kyogre out next to each other.
It's definitely going to be a little tricky with that Umbreon out. The pressure that it applied so early on with the Snarls and the Yawns, not really doing it too much now, despite the fact that it's sitting on the field completely healthy. That Tornadus as well. No stranger to those Protects, just opting yet again to stay safe as that Kyogre goes for that Max Geyser into the ground, and it certainly is going to pick up that KO. And Kyogre wins this match against the two restricted legendaries here, taking it out of the field, getting that opportunity to set its reign back up and really put on this pressure and gain all the momentum going into this late game here.
Yeah, I really like the Protect on Tornadus there. You don't need to fish for something like a Hurricane at that point. Now, I am curious if Groudon had any chance of surviving that attack. Once again, it is Max Geyser, but, you know, -2 special attack, the sun was up as well. Depending on Groudon is trained, I was thinking maybe there was a chance, but either way, Groudon goes down. And now you have this end game where, you know, Jonathan has the numbers advantage. Venusaur is really the only damage dealer here, right? And so if you can knock out the Venusaur, then it will be a 2v1. Yes, Umbreon has those increased stages of special attack, but Snarl does so little damage. Jonathan's Venusaur is fully healthy as well, so can go for those sleep powders onto the Umbreon. And so I think from Jonathan's end right now, it's really important to conserve the Kyogre. Make sure that Kyogre can stick around, because you are going to kind of need it in this end game, right? I think Umbreon could actually theoretically win in a 1v1 just because it can heal up while also putting Pokemon to sleep. But it's going to have a really tough time in a 2v1. So Jonathan really wants to make sure that this Kyogre sticks around. You try to knock out that Venusaur. You know that Leonardo's Venusaur also doesn't have Protect, so that leaves it relatively exposed. And then as soon as you lock out the Venusaur, then Kyogre can win the end game. And so you can see Jonathan realizing, hey, I should conserve the Kyogre. Let me switch it out right now.
Of course, Tornadus opting to just go for that Hurricane onto Leonardo's Venusaur here and taking it right out of the field. Of course, that Hurricane 100% accurate in the rain. So big KO there. Umbreon is just going to hit the foul play into the Venusaur, only just doing a little bit of a chip here. And I mean, this Umbreon is completely healthy, but like you said, this Umbreon is face down against 3 Pokemon on Jonathan's end here. So definitely has its back a little against the wall.
Yeah, and you can, of course, go for Sleep Powder now on Jonathan's end, right? I think for Jonathan to win this game, you just try to put the Umbreon to sleep. If it takes like a 2 or 3 turn sleep and you hit your Origin Pulses with the Kyogre, sure, it has those increased stages of special defense, but Origin Pulse single target with the Rain Up and that Mystic Water on Kyogre does do a lot of damage, right? So this is what I was saying earlier, right? Leonardo had a kind of a nice lead, but wasn't able to actually distribute enough damage across the board, and Jonathan was able to, manage to actually stay healthy with the Tornadus, with that Kyogre. The switch out here just gives you that free opportunity into Kyogre. Could have also just gone for a Hurricane, then you faint from the Life Orb immediately, and then get that switch in, but Venusaur notably is going to hit that Sleep Powder, so Umbreon will take a turn of sleep here. It's going to need to wake up quickly here if Leonardo wants to win the game.
It's always tricky when it comes down to those sleep turns. It can really kind of go either way. Get fortunate, get that wake up right away, or just be sleeping for the next 3 turns. So Leonardo is going to be sitting there, fingers crossed, hoping this Umbreon can hopefully wake up soon. Especially the Umbreon, you don't want that going to bed. You want to be putting other Pokemon to sleep with that Yawn, and sitting there on the field all by itself and asleep is certainly a dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, so it's so tough too because I don't think Umbreon just does enough damage in this endgame in a 3v1. And so Jonathan notably, was able to conserve all of his Pokemon that allows him to switch out, reset those potential Yawns or Snarl special attack drops. So Kyogre is going to start this off. It is going to hit the Origin Pulse. That's a big connect here, and see how much damage it does. Even with those special defense boosts, a sizable amount, and with this damage from Venusaur, might just be a 2-hit KO if the Kyogre hits next turn. So Umbreon needs to wake up here to have a chance, but it stays asleep.
That's so unfortunate. Of course, getting a little bit of leftover damage, but Leonardo's gonna need to get a little lucky going into this next turn with a wake up and a Origin Pulse miss. But we've seen before how tricky these specialty moves can be on the ground on, and Kyogre not the most accurate, so banking on a miss is not always the worst chance here. So it'll really come down to whether Jonathan can hit this or not. So be interesting to see how this shakes up, but it's definitely not looking too hot for Leonardo here.
Yeah, the tricky thing is even if you and he's able to connect, so yeah, that should just heal the game. But even with the miss, Umbreon just doesn't do enough damage, and it can't really heal back that much right now either way. So yeah, in the end, you basically have to hope for a kajillion misses from the Kyogre. It keeps whittling away with Snarl, so it wasn't like a 0% win condition necessarily, but the odds of it were very, very slim. So yeah, in this end, the Kyogre was able to put in so much work, and Leonardo just basically needs to be able to do more damage, right? The Incineroar plus Umbreon combination can work, but the thing is, Incineroar was not conserved for the Venusaur. It kind of just went down. What was really critical in this game was that Jonathan just pushed the go button and Dynamaxed that Kyogre despite Kyogre being at -1 special attack. The reason he was confident in doing that was because everything on Leonardo's end was already whittled away, and if you can eliminate that Venusaur, that really paves the way for late game Kyogre. So well played by Jonathan to finally decide when to go to max. And I think for Umbreon's end, sure, Snarl's helpful, but Jonathan can constantly switch out of it. So I needed to get a Yawn off into that Kyogre slot that turn, I think, to just delay it from doing as much damage. And every little bit of HP matters because it just means that you're allowed to conserve your Pokemon and switch and get rid of these potential special attack drops or Yawns.
It'll definitely be interesting to see how Leonardo adjusts into the last match. Of course, the Umbreon offering that pressure with the Snarl and Yawns, but being very passive otherwise. We saw it just sat there on the field at the end, and it was just... Jonathan didn't really have to target it down until the very end there as well. Leonardo did get all 3 turns of the max, did not go to bed, but at the same time didn't really get the opportunity to do too much except for building up that special defense, which ended up not being utilized on the Venusaur, as that did have to swap out into that Incineroar. So hopefully a little more aggressive in that game 3 here, but let's get into it. Of course, these are best of 5s, so Jonathan just needs to get 1 more win to be taking this set and moving on here. So we are going to see, he swapped up the weather every time here. So this time it's going to be that Torkoal again next to that Venusaur, with, yet again from Leonardo's side, that Umbreon next to the Venusaur.
So I think Leonardo, if you have Regieleki or Charizard in the back, that kind of fixes the previous problem of not doing enough damage in the early game, right? And so it's really tricky, though. If you lead Charizard and you try to max it turn 1 and Jonathan just hits you with the Sleep Powder, it's really, really bad. And so, once again, it's all around how do you play around the potential Sleep Powder on turn 1. Sleep Powder is not the most accurate attack, but it still hits, more often than not. And so, I would really like to see Leonardo bring either the Regieleki or the Charizard in the back and try to use that as more laking damage. Regieleki, notably, is actually really, really good, obviously, against the Kyogre, against that Tornadus, and actually against Torkoal as well. So, have to see if Leonardo actually made the adjustment this time around, or whether or not he just went with the same Pokemon.
Jonathan certainly making a big adjustment going into this game 3. Instead of the late game Dynamax, opting to go for that Venusaur max on the first turn, but Leonardo's Venusaur is going to go for his Sleep Powder and does connect it into that Torkoal. Jonathan going for that max ooze again into that Umbreon. Not too much damage here, but at least does get a special attack boost going into the next turn here. And what do you think about this start from Jonathan with that first turn Venusaur max?
Yeah, you know, this was kind of like how Game 1 played out, but this time Leonardo didn't switch out the Venusaur. I really liked that decision because it felt like in Game 1, Leonardo just lost so much on turn 1 and didn't put on any pressure. You know, actually, it had the Flare Blitz into Venusaur, I suppose, but at the same time, I think like this is a nice mix-up. Leonardo now trying to heal up with that Umbreon. I really like that decision as well because right now, I think you basically want to stall out the turns of max on Jonathan's end without losing too much, right? So the Sleep Powder notably connects on that Torkoal. It'll be really, really big whether or not it can wake up this next turn. Venusaur just starting things off with that Earth Power, gonna chip away at it. Fair amount of damage here. And I think because Leonardo has that Focus Sash on the Venusaur, you know, even if Jonathan went for a Max Flare turn 1 using that Weathered Ball, you know your Venusaur will at least survive the turn.
Of course. Jonathan going for the G-Max Vine Lash into that Umbreon, slowly whittling it down, and of course setting up that residual damage in the turns to come. Umbreon just taking the opportunity to heal up, and of course being in the sun, that Moonlight is going to heal so much on that Umbreon, even though it is going to take some Vine Lash damage here. I really like from Leonardo's end not maxing, just going for the Sleep Powder, going for that chip damage onto the Torkoal, and stalling out Jonathan's max here.
Yeah, I think Leonardo in a much better position this time around where the Umbreon is still relatively healthy. We've seen Umbreon be a really good asset in this matchup. You just need it to do a little bit more, right? So, you know, right now, Leonardo thinking of maxing that Venusaur, most notably Jonathan's Torkoal stayed asleep that last turn, wasn't able to get a potential fire type attack off. And so I like the decision to finally max Venusaur here. You pointed out how, you know, Leonardo didn't max Venusaur last turn, and I think that is a really smart decision. And now you have a fully healthy Venusaur that's able to max, get special defense boosts, and a Venusaur with special defense boost and 3 turns of max to play with is so good in this matchup. So even though Leonardo went with the same lead this time around, I think playing it out a little bit differently. Always scary to use Sleep Powder and rely on it hitting and getting, you know, multiple turns of sleep, but works out perfectly here. Let's see if this Max Quake can actually pick up the knockout onto the Torkoal. Oh, it hangs on.
Is so close. Leonardo, of course, in that first game, knew that the Max Quake wasn't going to do enough, went for some chip last turn with Earth Power, but unfortunately it wasn't enough for that to hit KO here. Umbreon will just take the opportunity to go for the Snarl and actually does pick up the KO on this Torkoal now. So that Max Wake did actually do enough that the Torkoal does not even get the opportunity to wake up and try and put some pressure back in with Yawn, which I think is going to be huge here. Jonathan, of course, took that Yawn, went to bed, but Leonardo really gets the opportunity to capitalize on his max here.
Yeah, I think Leonardo's in an amazing position right now. You've already gotten that special defense boost. You haven't even set up the G-Max Vine Lash yet. You know, that'll be really valuable in the late game. So from Jonathan's end, what's interesting now is how do you actually win this game, right? Part of it might be just going for a Hurricane, like Confusion onto Venusaur. I think, you know, what makes this also tough is that the Venusaur on Jonathan's end is asleep right now, right? Even if it wakes up, it's not really doing that much damage with something like a Weather Ball. And so this is what was so important. In the previous games, like Leonardo didn't get enough out of his max, and this time around, Venusaur is in a much better position where it hasn't taken any damage. You've already got a special defense boost on it. I really love Leonardo's decision to heal up with that Umbreon going for those Moonlights. So really great adjustment in terms of how he's been playing this.
For sure. That Tornado's just taking that opportunity to set up the Tailwind, get some speed control on his end as this Venusaur goes for that Max Flare into the Tornado's, dealing a very good amount of damage here. Umbreon as well going with that Snarl, lowering the Venusaur special attack yet again and bringing this Tornado's real down here and real close to getting KO'd.
Yeah, and I like the decision to just go for Weather Ball into Tornadus. That covers for an option of Jonathan switching Venusaur out into the Kyogre. You know, you don't want to just go for something like a Vine Lash on a Venusaur and the Venusaur stays in. So this Umbreon has been so much better this time around because it's actually supported by offense. And so hasn't even fallen below 50%. Well, has, but I guess it's healed it back up. Now continuing to go for that Moonlight. And once again, Jonathan's just in a really weird spot, right? Where you're still not pressuring with damage. Venusaur is going to take a Another turn of, oh, actually manages to wake up. Yeah, gets that weather ball off, and it is gonna miss the hurricane from Tornadus, and so I don't think that was gonna KO, but at least you have that chance of confusion. And you know, of course, you could always crit through that special defense drop as well. So Vine Lash now will knock out the Tornadus and set Leonardo for this endgame. I mean, he has a 4-2 lead, and this Umbreon is basically gonna be at full health. So what a different story from the last 2 games.
It was absolutely such an amazing adjustment from Leonardo's end. I mean, Jonathan had to hit that Hurricane, but of course the Hurricane in the Sun, that was the last turn of Sun too. Hurricane in the Sun is just such a gamble here. And I mean, at this point, do you really think that there's, with a Venusaur and assumedly that Kyogre in the back here, what do you think Jonathan can do to try and stay in this match? Or is Leonardo just too far ahead at this point?
Yeah, I think this game is over, to be honest. I mean, you'd have to hope for Leonardo to misplay severely, but the thing is, you can't even put the Kyogre to sleep, and we know that, you can't put the Venusaur to sleep, right? And so you can't sleep powder Venusaur. Normally with Venusaur, like, your win con is to try to put everything to sleep and do damage, but Leonardo's barely taken any damage so far, and there's the special defense boost on Leonardo's side, and you have that Vine Lash damage adding up, and so it feels like the only way you can win is maybe a Thunder Paralysis onto Venusaur. Leonardo can get around that by just going for Grass-type attacks into the Kyogre, though, and I mean, yeah, Leonardo's basically taken no damage in this game because the Umbreon's healed off so well. So this kind of feels like game over to me at this point, to be honest, unless like Leonardo, you know, severely misplays, but it just has such a monumentous lead, and Leonardo hasn't even revealed his back Pokemon yet.
Kyogre just going for that Water Spout, does deal a good amount of damage to both, all things considered, but neither being KO'd. Jonathan Venusaur will just take the opportunity to hit the Sludge Bomb into Leonardo, and it finally take down one of Leonardo's Pokemon here. That Umbreon, though, firing it back with a Yawn, and we've seen how much pressure Yawn has put out, and since Jonathan's down to his last 2, no opportunity to be swapping out, so that Venusaur, unfortunately, is going to be going back to bed.
Yeah, and there's the Regieleki, so I love Leonardo's mix-up here. You know, I guess one way Jonathan could have won is if you just had way too many passive Pokemon once again, or, you know, went for Snarl rather than Yawn. Yawn is absolutely the correct decision in this position because then the Venusaur will guaranteed fall asleep after this next turn. Maybe Kyogre has a chance if it is able to crit Groudon with a Water Spout. You always want to protect Groudon here because you don't want to take an attack from that Venusaur, but because Leonardo correctly brought that Regieleki in the back as well, it makes it even harder, and you know, that will just cleanly knock out the Kyogre. So I guess with Groudon, you could always miss Precipice Blades. Umbreon actually dodges, looks like that Sleep Powder as well, so you know, Jonathan had the opportunity to maybe just go for a Water Spell and a Sludge Bomb or any attack from the Venusaur, but Jonathan probably not confident in that picking up the knockout, and of course this is the downside of Sleep Powder. It can miss. Even without that miss, I mean, even if that had connected, I think Leonardo would still be in a really amazing position, but would need to hit the Precipice Blades, right? That's always relatively inaccurate. But Kyogre is really on a timer. It's going to just take so much Vine Lash damage in these next couple of turns, and so I think the only way Jonathan can pull off a miracle comeback right now is you get a critical hit onto the Groudon with a Origin Pulse. But yeah, it's looking really slim right now. Still, you know, not giving up though, because of course the chance of that is bigger than 0%, right? So if you have a win condition, you absolutely go for it. But because there's that Regieleki in the back as well, it makes this even tougher.
Yeah, at least if Jonathan can get in a position to see that Regieleki in the back, could make adjustments going into the next game, but if Leonardo can just clean this up and not reveal that, certainly is going to be helpful going into the next match here. Groudon is going to connect that Precipice Blades, dealing a really good amount of damage to that Venusaur and bringing it within range for this Umbreon to just take it out and leave this poor Kyogre against the world here.
So one thing I do want to talk about is that Leonardo is playing this endgame correctly, right? Leonardo had such a big lead in this game, but it was still possible for him to theoretically like throw the game by misplaying, correctly going for the Yawns at the right times, correctly doubling up onto Venusaur, knowing that Venusaur does not have Protect. So Precipice Blades, most importantly for Leonardo, connects there onto the Venusaur, and with that double up is able to pick up the KO. I like Jonathan's play there. You're basically hoping for Leonardo to misplay, right? You hope for the Umbreon to not target Venusaur or maybe miss a Snarl. Leonardo correctly went for that foul play, so that double up guaranteed the KO. And if you go for something like a Snarl, there is a chance to miss, and then there is a chance for Venusaur to wake up the subsequent turn. So that Sleep Powder miss on Umbreon definitely made things easier for Leonardo in this endgame. Doesn't actually even have to reveal that Regieleki, and so that could be a really big tech going into game 4, because I think Regieleki was part of Leonardo's strategy in this game, and Jonathan might have been expecting Incineroar this whole time. So not revealing that's actually a really big deal, because now you can keep that secret and just go with the same 4 Pokemon going into this next game.
Certainly. We saw how much Kyogre did in the end games in game 1 and game 2, and Regieleki, the perfect thing to pair it down against it. That was such a fantastic match, though, especially from Leonardo's end, with that Umbreon, and managing to hit that Sleep Powder, into that Torkoal, eliminate the opportunity from Jonathan to be going for those yawns and be pushing pressure back, delaying the max by a couple of turns. I think it was really, really well played, and different considering it was the same lead all 3 times, but a very different outcome. So I'm excited to see how he's going to play in this match 4 here. So let's get into it. Of course, he needs to be winning 2 back-to-back here to be moving on, whereas Jonathan still only needs to be taking 1 here to be advancing. So we will see that Torkoal and Venusaur again from Jonathan's end, pacing down, of course, with that Umbreon and Venusaur from Leonardo here.
Yeah, so, last time Jonathan just got hit by that Sleep Powder, I think Leonardo can tend to just go for the same play. Yeah, Sleep Powder into Torkoal, Yawn into Venusaur. So, the question is, does Jonathan risk the Sleep Powder on the Torkoal once again, right? You know that the Yawn's probably coming your way as well. I think, Jonathan certainly has a lot of mix-ups that you can make in terms of the elite adjustments, such as bringing Incineroar out, but willing to just play with the same lead. So, similar situation. Now, if Leonardo misses Sleep Powder on turn 1, once again, it's such a huge blow, right? And you just lose so much out of it. So Jonathan, of course, could protect with his Torkoal on turn 1. The Venusaur could opt for a Weather Ball immediately onto Leonardo's Venusaur. One thing that I think is really critical is that Jonathan ends up maxing Venusaur and he just gets hit by a Yawn every time, and that means you only get 2 turns of max rather than 3. And looks like willing to, just Dynamax or Gigantamax once again. So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to see if this ends up just playing out the same way. Maybe Torkoal this time opts for a Protect rather, or maybe Jonathan's just saying, hey, your odds of hitting Sleep Powder and then me waking up after 1 turn, there's a lot that can go right for Jonathan here, because Sleep Powder is such a various-inducing move. But no Protect from Torkoal, no switch outs, gonna get hit by that Sleep Powder once again.
That Torkoal 2 games in a row now, falling asleep on that first turn. And we're gonna see the max ooze into Venusaur this time around, though, not dealing the most damage here. I'm really interested to see that he did opt to go for that max first turn yet again, knowing that there is that Yawn pressure from that Umbreon, and of course the Yawn this out. How do you feel about that Venusaur max with that Yawn? I mean, it didn't work out too well in the last game. How could he have played this upcoming turn differently to hopefully not have the same thing happen?
Yeah, I mean, the problem for Jonathan that last game was that he targeted Umbreon, right? And Umbreon just healed all the damage off, so at least now you have dealt damage on the Venusaur. But the awkward thing is you always want to Vine Lash with Venusaur before it falls asleep, right? And so if Venusaur doesn't go for that Vine Lash, then you don't get that residual damage. Earth Power on Leonardo, Venusaur's, goes first, and so that's a lot of damage into Torkoal. Once again, so critical that Sleep Powder is actually able to hit, because if it does miss, that puts Jonathan in a much better position. But yeah, forced to go for that Vine Lash onto Umbreon, but this is the awkward thing, right? Sure, you've damaged Venusaur, you've damaged Umbreon, but nothing's actually getting KO'd right now. So once again, let's see if Torkoal can get a critical Wake Up right now, because that would be huge, potentially just getting a big Fire-type attack off into both of these Pokemon. Oh, and it stays asleep.
Unfortunately, that Torkoal is not waking up anytime soon. And Leonardo, much like last game, hitting that Earth Power into that Torkoal just to bring it right down within KO range for next turn. And we saw how key picking up that KO on the Torkoal was last game. And unfortunately, that Torkoal not waking up is very vulnerable to just getting KO'd and not doing much in this game either.
Yeah, I think Torkoal and Venusaur have had a long day, Sierra. They kept getting led, and they just really want to take a nap here. So, once again, Jonathan does not get the favorable rolls, right? Gets hit by the Sleep Powder, takes 2 turns of sleep. A Wake Up is always so critical, but now Venusaur is guaranteed to fall asleep, right? It has to take a turn of sleep here, and now the Umbreon can heal all the way back up as well. Torkoal does manage to wake up here, but once again, Leonardo off to a really strong start in this match.
course, at least it's not going anywhere yet, but of course the Venusaur is going to be sleeping. The Umbreon just taking the opportunity to heal up. I mean, we've seen how annoying this Umbreon has been so far, so just getting the opportunity to heal it up and being more annoying is definitely favorable for Leonardo here. And paired with that leftovers, that Vine Lash that residual damage from the Vine Lash isn't going to be doing as much.
Yeah, and part of it is, you know, maybe Jonathan's willing to play the same way in the last 2 games because you know that you have 3 games, right? He was up 2-0. All you needed to do is win 1 of the 3. So it's like the odds of Leonardo hitting Sleep Powder and then me taking multiple turns of sleep in multiple games are relatively slim. So I would have liked to see Jonathan maybe make a mix-up in the lead because at the end of the day, like, this is still... like, you're basically reacting to Leonardo's play, right, rather than making a more proactive play, and Jonathan has not had the rolls going his way in these last 2 games, and once again, we're in a similar position where Jonathan just didn't really get very much out of the max, and the combination of Venusaur ignoring the Gmax Vine Lash damage as well as Umbreon healing it off means that the Vine Lash is just so much less effective than it normally is.
For sure. Venusaur from Leonardo is just going to hit that Weather Ball into Jonathan's Venusaur, and after multiple turns of sleep is just going to take it off of the field entirely. Snarl coming out from Umbreon here. This Torkoal, though, finally getting the opportunity to go for its own yawn onto Leonardo's Venusaur here.
Yeah, it gets the yawn off, but not really sure that's enough to pull off a comeback right now, right? Like a fire-type attack there at least maybe gets the knockout and you get the ball rolling a little bit more, but now Leonardo gets another turn with the Venusaur. You could even switch out. And with the Venusaur out of the way on Jonathan's end, I mean, that definitely paves the way a little bit more for the Pokemon Leonardo has in the back. Now, what I'm interested is if you actually have that Regieleki, it actually could be a really strong max option at this point because you've eliminated Venusaur. Venusaur is the one Pokemon that can resist the attack. There is the Regieleki right now. So Leonardo, once again, just off to such a big lead. And this time around, he actually has the damage output in the late game as well, right? Like, I think the issue in that second game was that, sure, Umbreon got all these boosts, but its partners weren't able to do enough. So, once again, I think it's really smart that Leonardo has now dropped the Incineroar for that Regieleki because that just offers so much more late game offense and actually opens up a new win condition where, hey, now if you knock out Venusaur on Jonathan's end, Regieleki, even if it doesn't Dynamax, does a lot of damage, but as a max option, can just one-shot everything. So, for Jonathan's end, it's important to try to get weather control, get that Kyogre in rain. That's really the only way you can actually deal with Regieleki. You know, you need to set up a Tailwind, but I think Leonardo willing to stall things out a little bit. If you can eliminate that Torkoal, you can actually gain weather control. This is a nice switch by Jonathan, though. You get the Kyogre in rain, and Leonardo actually switched out into that Groudon, so Jonathan does win the weather war at least right now.
Leonardo, of course, wanting to swap that Venusaur out just so it doesn't fall asleep, but of course losing the weather war is never too positive, and this made us hitting a big Hurricane into that Groudon, deal a nice chunk of damage here, bringing it down to about half after the berry. Umbreon, though, just taking the opportunity to put some more pressure on Jonathan's end and go for a yawn into that slot there.
Yeah, the yawn is interesting, right? Because now it puts Jonathan in a really weird spot. If you stay in with Tornadus, that slot falls asleep. Maybe you can knock out the Umbreon with the Hurricane Water Spout, right? But Jonathan might feel forced to switch out here with the Tornadus. But if you switch out, then I'm not sure Kyogre actually knocks out the Umbreon in the rain, right? Or in the sun, I should say, if Jonathan brings out that Torkoal. So it's a really weird spot for Jonathan. I love the decision to go for a yawn there. Basically, in these end games, the Umbreon's able to put in so much work because it basically forces Jonathan to cycle the Pokemon in and out, and there it is. It's going to be that Tornado switch out, but let's see if Umbreon can take an attack here. I feel like it should survive a Water Spout or an Origin Pulse from this Kyogre. Survival would be really, really key here.
The dual weather is always so strong, but the fact that Jonathan now has to lower his own Kyogre's special attack here and have it out in sun is definitely a negative, but is going to be hitting that Water Spout and not really doing too much in the face of the sun here. Umbreon then just getting the opportunity to go for a Snarl, reducing what this Kyogre can do even more at this point.
Yeah, and you know, Leonardo just in such a strong position right now, I think. getting that snarl off. The Umbreon's actually now definitely not going to fade to Kyogre, and Venusaur also puts on pressure into Kyogre, so it can just keep healing itself up, and this is, yeah, just night and day from those first two matches, where I think Umbreon is actually just such a critical component in this matchup, and Leonardo's just done such a good job protecting it this time around, and Jonathan, you know, was put in a really awkward position where I think it may have been better to just stayed in with the Tornadus and let your Tornadus fall asleep, but Jonathan, of course, feels, hey, if that happens, then I just lose all momentum whatsoever. So gonna go for another switch here, but now it feels like Leonardo has so much control, and he still has that Regieleki in this endgame as well.
I really like at this point that Regieleki hasn't been revealed. This goes down to a game 5. That could be the difference maker there. Umbreon, of course, it's not been knocked out yet, and it's not going to be knocked out anytime soon. Just taking that opportunity to go for another Moonlight and bringing itself all the way up to full in that Sunlight here.
Yeah, I just, like, don't see how you really knock out Umbreon at this point, right? Like, the way Jonathan beat it in the endgame earlier was, hey, let me put it to sleep and let me, like, target it 2v1, but this time around, Leonardo still has all of his Pokemon, so at one, you know, you want to address the Umbreon, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, there's the Leaf Storm from the Venusaur. The Kyogre is actually able to hang on, but that's so much damage at that point, and that's all Umbreon needs, right? It needs a partner that can actually deal damage. That's a fantastic Leaf Storm. Really critical that it was actually able to hit there. I mean, the thing is, in a matchup like this, there's always so many inaccurate attacks, and so that could definitely turn the tides at any given point, but able to connect there. Kyogre is going to go for the Water Spell. Water Spell in Sun does exactly 1 damage to Umbreon.
It's not too often that you see a Kyogre do that little damage. It's such a titan and force to be reckoned with, but 1 point of damage definitely feels bad here. So Leonardo now, with that Venusaur going down to the Heat Wave, is actually going to be bringing that Regieleki in. This Regieleki, like, against this Kyogre that's almost gone, and this Tornadus definitely looking real good.
Yeah, one thing that was interesting, I was wondering if Leonardo could have won this game without revealing Regieleki. That's actually such a key adjustment, like he didn't reveal in that last game. And so I was thinking, you know, because Umbreon is relatively tanky, and it can, like, the only way you can really lose if you bring out Groudon is eating up a bunch of crits, right? So I was thinking like Umbreon plus Groudon could maybe seal up this endgame, but Leonardo probably just wants to go for the guaranteed win this game as quickly as possible, so is going to end up Dynamaxing that Regieleki. I mean, this is the perfect opportunity to do so. You have already chipped away at the Kyogre. Everything is going to faint from the Max Lightning, and even if you protect at this point, Max Lightning should just one-shot every single Pokemon. So Leonardo conserving this Regieleki, eliminating the main threat to it in Venusaur in the early game, and normally, you know, Regieleki is a Pokemon that doesn't Dynamax that frequently, although, you know, the meta has trended a little bit more towards Dynamax Regieleki lately, but either way, makes that key adjustment and now should be able to just sweep through. Tailwind is helpful, right? But at the same time, everything's just going to faint at this point, and there's still no way to really deal with this Umbreon. So Kyogre can come out and is probably going to need to try to crit some Origin Pulses at this point, because I'm not even sure a Hurricane plus Origin Pulse KOs the Regieleki in this position. And if Kyogre is slow, it might just be not able to outspeed Regieleki even with the Tailwind up.
Yeah, Regieleki is not the most bulky of Pokemon, but certainly in Dynamax form is going to be difficult to take out. And regardless, Tornadus won't even get the opportunity to try and go for a Hurricane, as the Yawn the previous turn is going to make it go to sleep here. So this Kyogre on just a couple of HP is gonna have to do something, but I don't really know what it can do up against this Umbreon and this gigantic Regieleki here.
Yeah, and with Leonardo having that Groudon, I love the decision to switch out here. You just get the Sun up, so even if Kyogre outspeeds you and crits you, yeah, there's no way you can actually pull off the win there. So Jonathan recognizing that, and for what was a really great start to Jonathan, you know, he started the set up 2-0. It is now 2-2. Leonardo was 1 game away from a reverse sweep, and we don't see best of fives very often in competitive VGC. This is our, you know, like our first time casting an official best of 5, and this is so exciting. It goes down to the 5th and final game.
Especially with the best of 5s, I mean, normally in a best of 3, Jonathan being up 2-0 would have just taken the set right there, but with this best of 5, Leonardo having that opportunity to make those key adjustments going into game 3 and game 4 there. And I mean, we were talking about maybe not revealing that Regieleki, but at the same time, I do like just taking the sure win con there. I mean, there's so much that can happen in a match, and Jonathan, of course, is going to fight tooth and nail to stay in that match. Trying to keep that Regieleki hidden in the back could potentially put Leonardo under a little bit of pressure there, and you definitely don't want to be throwing a game by trying to hide information. So I do like the Regieleki coming out. I like a Dynamax and just taking the sure win and bringing this to a 2-2 for these players.
I'm so excited for this game 5. I mean, Zero, we were talking about it before getting into this match. I really think both players have a lot of adjustments they can make. I think that Charizard certainly can make some sense in this matchup, and I think from Jonathan's end, I mean, he keeps leading with Venusaur Torkoal. It didn't work out very well in the last 2 games, so I'd kind of like to see a lead adjustment from him, because I feel like you are basically rolling a bunch of dice, right? You're hoping for the Sleep Powder to miss or to wake up quickly enough with Torkoal, but that's not exactly a very reliable strategy now, and it must be a little bit frustrating for Jonathan, right? You've already had 2 games where, yeah, Torkoal gets hit by the Sleep Powder, you take 2 turns of sleep, and that's basically like the worst possible outcome at that point, because then Leonardo just gains such a lead. So I would really, really like to see Jonathan switch up the leads here, because I just feel like Torkoal Venusaur isn't working. You're gonna expect that Sleep Powder, you're gonna expect that Yawn on turn 1, and in the end, Jonathan keeps getting hit by that Yawn onto Venusaur, and Venusaur just isn't able to do enough in its turns of max. So I think it starts from the leads here, and I would love to see Jonathan make a mix-up, maybe leading that Incineroar so you pressure with Fake Out, or even Flare Blitz onto the Venusaur on turn 1.
Yeah, certainly being up 2 games, Jonathan willing to roll a couple of dice and trying to get something in his favor, willing to make that risk, but unfortunately it didn't work out too well, and certainly there has to be an adjustment here. No more relying on chance, no more rolling of the die. It's time to get into game 5 here, and it's time to close out this absolutely fantastic series from these players to see who is going to be moving on into the finals here, and unfortunately there's no lead adjustment from Jonathan here. We see that Venusaur, we see that Torkoal, hoping we see a little bit of a different plan here, and they will be facing down against that same Umbreon against that Venusaur here.
Man, I mean, I think Jonathan here, you could make the decision to not max Venusaur, right? Venusaur keeps getting hit by the Yawn as it maxes, but he's gonna max once again, so willing to basically lose the last turn of max just, you know, to get an early lead. I think one thing here is that, you know, Leonardo's Venusaur could have the potential to also max on turn 1 and max Flare into Jonathan's Venusaur. So one reason to explain Jonathan's play is, hey, like, if Leonardo doesn't keep going for the same plays and tries to go for that max Flare play, I can capitalize by maxing my Venusaur, but it's gonna be Sleep Powder. It's gonna hit the Torkoal for the 3rd time in a row.
3 games in a row, this Sleep Powder hits. Sleep Powder not being the most accurate, but is definitely putting in work for Leonardo here as Max Ooze, yet again, this is the exact same as the last game there, and I don't know if I really like this from Jonathan's end, because the same things are happening, and that didn't fare too well last match.
Yeah, I really think Jonathan keeps expecting a mix-em from Leonardo's end, right? We've seen Leonardo's Venusaur be speedier, so I wouldn't be surprised if Jonathan keeps expecting Leonardo to finally just max Venusaur on turn 1, max Flare Venusaur, expecting Jonathan's Venusaur not to max. But the reality is, you want to lead something that there's like a consistent play to make every time, right? Jonathan keeps going for the same play, and there's no play that covers every option from Leonardo's end, which is why, you know, we're talking about potential lead adjustment. But once again, Sleep Powder hits, and man, I mean, if Torkoal stays asleep once again, takes that 2-turn sleep, it's just such a big lead for Leonardo once again. So Torkoal, you know, has really been sleepy in this set. Let's see if he can wake up this time around.
As well, Leonardo took the last 2 games doing this strategy, so I don't see why you'd switch it up too much though. Jonathan, though, opting not to go for that Vine Lash into the Umbreon here, not setting up the residual damage from the Vines, but instead opting to just take the KO on the Venusaur, which is definitely a little bit of a shakeup finally coming out on his end here.
Yeah, and Torkoal once again takes another turn of sleep, and so, you know, Jonathan not really getting the favorable rolls here, but not making any adjustments to, you know, try to mitigate those rolls in the first place. So now Regieleki is able to just come out. Venusaur has to take a guaranteed turn of sleep. You can go for Snarl here. You know, one thing that's actually really critical here is if the Torkoal can protect this turn, because Leonardo wants to push the go button with Regieleki immediately. So if you get a protect off, that does bypass a turn of the Dynamax, and Regieleki is just so much stronger when max. But I like the approach there, right? You whittle away at the Venusaur so it can't do that much damage. You set up the Electric Train with Regieleki so that you can't Sleep Powder with Venusaur even if Jonathan gets a quick wake up. And Max Lightning can one-shot Torkoal, can one-shot Tornadus, one-shot Kyogre. So Jonathan not making an adjustment to the leads. I think maybe expecting Leonardo to make a different play, and, you know, ends up getting hit by Sleep Powder all 3 turns and all 3 games, and ends up taking 2 turns of sleep in each one. And Torkoal doesn't try to protect here, so it's just gonna get sniped by this Max Lightning.
Well, as they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Leonardo, of course, opted for the same beginning. Obviously, a little bit different now with that Venusaur being knocked out, but that Regieleki maxing yet again and is just taking that Torkoal out. And I mean, going on from here on out, none of these Pokemon can be put to sleep with that lightning terrain. So Leonardo got all that pressure, putting Jonathan inside of the board asleep, and is not going to be punished going to sleep in return from the Venusaur when it finally decides to wake up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at this point, Jonathan's path to victory is basically stall out Regieleki's max, get Tailwind, and then you try to get Kyogre in the rain and just spam Origin Pulses, right? But Leonardo just in such a good spot because once again, Jonathan just keeps only getting 2 turns of max, and this time around not even getting that Vine Lash off. So yeah, I mean, I just feel like Regieleki is in such a phenomenal position right now where even if Venusaur wakes up, you're going to basically try to hope for a critical hit. And this Regieleki just does so much damage with the max lightnings. One thing that's important here is, yeah, who do you target with the Regieleki? You might be expecting a Protect on the Tornadus. If you max lightning and, you know, double up onto the Venusaur, Venusaur might just faint. So you know that the Venusaur on Jonathan's end doesn't have Protect, but at the same time, maybe you feel willing to max lightning Tornadus anyway because you know Venusaur isn't actually that big of an offensive threat, especially with that electric terrain being up.
As Tornadus, though, is going to opt to go for the Protect here anyways. Regieleki, of course, is going to be doing a lot of damage to it through that Protect, bringing it right down. Tornadus is definitely not looking too good, and neither is that Venusaur as it just takes another turn of sleep here.
Yeah, I mean, even if Venusaur wakes up here, like, I feel like the best you can do is try to crit a Leaf Storm. It's at multiple stages of decreased special attack now, and I like how Leonardo played that, right? If you knock out the Venusaur, you actually give Jonathan a free switch into Kyogre, and you don't want to do that. Right now, Jonathan is in a really passive spot where neither of these Pokemon can do any damage, and it's going to be really tough for Jonathan to win at this point, right? Because, like, there's still not great damage output. It's only down to that Kyogre. I think Tornadus needs to set a Tailwind on this last turn, and Umbreon, you know, just is able to just keep spamming these Snarls, and that means Jonathan doesn't even get a free switch into that Kyogre. So the combination of Electric Terrain being set up and also being able to decrease special attack is so valuable here. So I think Jonathan needs the Tailwind here and then hope to sweep with the Kyogre in the end game. There is that Tailwind coming up. I mean, Venusaur waking up can certainly help a little bit, but it's just not doing that much, and it takes a 3rd turn of sleep. The sleep rolls are just not going for Jonathan in this set.
Leonardo, of course, just finishing off that Tornadus here. I mean, in a match all about those yawns and the sleep powders, Leonardo has definitely had the upper end here as the Venusaur has just been asleep for so long, and this Umbreon just free to just hit yet another Snarl, and now it's just going to be this Venusaur and presumably this Kyogre in the back here against an absolutely terrifying Regieleki, and of course, there it is, that Kyogre.
Yeah, and so, you know, Jonathan has played towards his win condition, and that is stall out the max and then get the Kyogre in rain under Tailwind. But the thing is that Leonardo still has that Groudon on the back. This Venusaur is not doing very much damage. Umbreon can continue to Snarl, and more importantly, there are still 2 turns of Electric Terrain, so you can't just slam Sleep Powder. So I think this is a great play. Yeah, you go for the potential Protect, Snarl, Kyogre. Now, Jonathan could theoretically win, I think, if you manage to knock out the Umbreon here, critical hit Water Spout. So I like this. Yeah, switch out into Groudon. That way you get a guaranteed Snarl off, and a single Snarl and change the weather puts you in a position where you just can't knock out Umbreon. So this turn's really interesting, right? You see Leonardo debate between the Protect and the switch out. I think switching is better because with the switch, even if Umbreon gets crit, it will survive the turn. Leonardo might be a little bit hesitant to actually set up the Sun for Venusaur. And so that being said, if you get Snarls off, then Jonathan's Pokemon can't do that much damage. So I do think it is correct to switch out. So Jonathan's win condition at this point is hope for a bunch of misses and maybe a bunch of crits. You know, Regieleki isn't that bulky, so even with the Snarls, you know, it's not going to take that many attacks, but I do think it's really important to actually go for the switch rather than just stay in with Regieleki and Protect, because then that opens the path for Umbreon to faint a little bit easier. But Venusaur finally wakes up. It's going to go for that Sludge Bomb onto the Regieleki slot, so Umbreon looking really healthy in this endgame now.
That Venusaur too, getting the poison on the Groudon here, and this Water Spout doing massive damage to the Groudon. It is going to be getting the berry from the Groudon here, but this Groudon is not looking too healthy, and with the poison to boot, it's not looking too good. But of course, this Umbreon is the important one. Hold on, and hits that Snarl into both of these Pokemon, just hoping to lower the damage they can do in upcoming turns to make sure that Regieleki, when it comes in, can do so safely.
Yeah, Groudon critically hanging on there as well, so Leonardo basically gets another turn. I can't stress enough, once again, how big of a deal setting up that electric trade was, because Jonathan definitely could have had comeback potential, and he still can come back in this game. It's not over by any means, but that electric trade makes things harder, because typically when you're playing from behind, the Venusaurs basically just want to spam Sleep Powder, right? So at this point, you've got in multiple decreased stages of special attack. That's really valuable. But, you know, the electric trade does expire after this turn, so that opens the path for Venusaur to, you know, go for Sleep Powders later on. So this is going to be a really close finish, but Regieleki looking pretty good in this endgame. It's still really difficult to actually knock out the Umbreon, especially with all these decreased stages of special attack.
Jonathan looking to try and start getting some damage onto that Umbreon. Hits his Sludge Bomb into it, and of course another Water Spout, out, and not really doing too much. This Umbreon, staying pretty, is just going to go for a Foul Play into the Venusaur to try and eliminate it, to just leave this Kyogre all by itself yet again.
Yeah, and, you know, the Groudon once again notably hangs on, so the combination of that Citrus Berry allows it to survive a little bit longer. Now what's notable is that Electric Terrain is gone, right? So from Jonathan's perspective, I think you basically really want to hit this Sleep Powder onto Umbreon. That's probably your best option. I don't think a double up on Umbreon will pick up the knockout, so Venusaur needs to go for Sleep Powder right now. If it doesn't hit, it feels like a really, really tough position for Jonathan. Kyogre's still healthy, notably, right? Without Electric Terrain, the Regieleki does do less damage, but there's the Sleep Powder, and it is going to connect with the Umbreon. That's a really critical hit.
Jonathan finally putting stuff to sleep on Leonardo's side here, and Kyogre will go for the Water Spout yet again, picking up the KO on the ground on here and leaving it down to this Regieleki and Umbreon endgame here.
And Umbreon, you know, keeps healing back a little bit. Venusaur and Kyogre special attack is decreased a little bit as well. I am curious to see how the Venusaur and the Regieleki are trained. Sometimes, like, people, you know, players might not run that much speed investment, so it's like even with the sun up, there's a chance Regieleki can actually outspeed Venusaur right now. So, Jonathan, right now, you have two decisions, right? You can either go for that Sleep Powder onto Regieleki, or you can hope to just get a critical hit with the Venusaur and just try to snipe away at it with something like a Leaf Storm. So this is going to be really, really close. It does feel like it might come down to sleep turns, and Regieleki is faster than the Venusaur despite sun being up.
The Regieleki outspeeding, picking up a key KO on this Venusaur here. Kyogre going to go for that Water Spout yet again, but unfortunately, in that sun, not doing nearly enough damage to pick up either of these KOs. Umbreon does wake up as well. The Sleep Powder connected, but did not keep it to sleep for too long. Healing up, getting that Moonlight and the leftovers. I mean, this looks really difficult for Jonathan here.
Yeah, with the Regieleki actually being faster than the Venusaur, there was actually really no way for Jonathan to win that game. Even if the Water Spout crit the Regieleki would survive the turn. So I think, you know, we hadn't really seen this Regieleki-Venusaur matchup too much throughout the course of this match, and in the end, really critical that is able to outspeed there in the end. So this is why Regieleki is such a strong Pokemon in this format. It can outspeed so many things, even when they're at double their speed with something like Tailwind or Chlorophyll. So Leonardo gets